This is Bob Short and Reflections on Georgia Politics, sponsored by the Russell Library at the University of Georgia and Young Harris College. Our guest is Tom Baxter, former political columnist at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and editor of the Southern Political Report. Welcome, Tom.
Good to be here.
Thank you. It all began in Montgomery, Alabama.
That's right, it did all begin in Montgomery. I grew up there, and I went to school up north at Washington University in St. Louis. And then after college, I worked at a couple of newspapers. I worked at a little paper up in Columbia, Maryland, the new town between D.C. and Baltimore, for a short time, and then got a job at the News and Courier, the old Charleston, the News and Courier, Charleston, South Carolina, and worked there for about 2.5 years. And there was at that time there was a tremendous South Carolina mafia here at the Atlanta newspapers. There were all these guys who had worked at different newspapers in South Carolina, had come over here and had contacts back in the state, and sort of brought some of us along. So it was really through a couple of guys who had come over and worked at the Atlanta Journal previously. One of them had come back to the News and Courier, and we became good friends. Charlie Seabrook, the great environmental writer for many years for the Journal-Constitution, was one of those folks. Charlie was born and raised on Johns Island, right outside of Charleston. So through those contacts in 1974, I got a job with the old Atlanta Journal when the Journal and the Constitution were separate staffs. And I had, at that time, as a young man reporting, I avoided political stories and the political beat because Montgomery is an intensely political town. I had been an intern at the Montgomery Advertiser for a couple of summers when I was in college. And in fact, my first political race that I knew anything about, where I had actually been in a newsroom on election night, was the famous George Wallace Albert Brewer race, which was later a professor here at Kennesaw wrote a book about dirty campaigns and rated that as the dirtiest political campaign of all time. Well, that was really my first one from a journalistic experience. But always the people who covered politics were people, and I'll give you an example of a guy you will remember. When I went to work as an intern at the Montgomery Advertiser, the star political writer was a fellow named Milo Dakin. Yeah. Who would later go on to become a lobbyist and a political consultant and an ally of Tom Murphy's, and helped Tom Murphy in several of his races. And so it was kind of that way everywhere I went, and I sort of developed the attitude that I didn't want to pursue the political beat because, that was already, the good jobs were already taken, and there were a lot of great things to do in terms of environmental writing, and the energy story was developing at that time. I covered the 3 Mile Island disaster after I came to Atlanta. So in those, working for those first papers and then working here at the AJC, I went that route. I was always interested in politics, but just didn't want to do it. And I became the Sunday perspective editor. There was, at that time, there was the opinion section was called the perspective section. I was named to that post in the around the late 70s, 79. Did that for a year or two, and then became the national editor. And as the national editor, one of the things that I did was to be sort of the on-the-ground guy coordinating the chain's coverage of both the national political conventions in that year in San Francisco and Dallas. And it was about as close as I really wanted to get to politics, frankly, at that point. But what happened was that there was a change of the guard at the Journal-Constitution. Jim Minner had been the editor, and Bill Kovich from the New York Times was brought in to be the editor while I was the national editor. And I became convinced of a couple of things after only a few weeks of working around Bill. Bill and I, remained friends for many years after he left the AJC. But I was completely convinced that if you didn't have some association with the New York Times prior to his coming there, and you were a department head, you were simply the walking dead. You were going to be eliminated for somebody who he had in mind at some point down the line. And the other thing I was convinced of was that we had, at that time, we knew that the big Super Tuesday primary had already taken shape for 1988, and Atlanta had won the national convention, the Democratic National Convention. So we knew that politics was going to be the big deal for the next couple of years, and I decided, I'd rather be in the fire than the frying pan. And so after Bill had been in charge at the AJC for just a few weeks, I went into his office and sat down and said, we have some frustrations with where I am right now, and I'd really like to be doing something in an active way. If what we're going to be involved in is covering this presidential campaign, I'd like to volunteer for some job where I'm doing that full time. And I did not know that 10 minutes before walking into that office, Bill Shipp had walked out of that office. And Bill, I haven't ever talked to Bill about this, but I know that Bill Shipp and Bill Kovich had a conversation about how he wanted to cover the national presidential campaign, and he had Kovich had very ambitious plans for the way that he wanted to do it. And it basically involved somebody getting on the road and living out of a suitcase for a year and a half. And Bill had no taste for that, and had also sort of, it was a change in the administration in terms of the people that he really was comfortable with. So he had left his job in that just before I walked in. And Kovich said, well, how would you like to be the chief political correspondent? Well, I didn't know at the time that he desperately needed one, because the one he had decided to designate had refused the job. But I took that. And as a result of that, I spent, the way that beat was defined at that time was I covered politics outside of Georgia. There were other people who had dibs on the State House and who covered things here, and my responsibility was to learn all of the Democratic and Republican Party officials all over the South, and to really get to know them very well so that we could really be ahead of everybody else in the coverage of the Super Tuesday primaries, and particularly to get to know all the people who would be coming to the Atlanta convention and that sort of thing. And I had, great good luck, and I guess in the early days of doing that. I was older, than most guys who start out covering a political beat at that time. And I went to a Republican National Committee meeting. I don't know even where it was, if it was up in Washington or it may have been one that was down in New Orleans. But I will always remember that I walked in maybe 40 minutes before the RNC meeting was going to begin, and there was one guy in the room who I walked over and introduced myself to and got to talking to, and that was Haley Barbour, who at that time was a national committee man from Mississippi. And Haley was a tremendous help to me then and later on, and just sort of showing me the ropes, the internal workings of the Republican National Committee is a sort of politics not many people know a lot about. And he knew all the players, and he knew, all the ins and outs, and he just gave me a tremendous leg up. And then another guy I met fairly shortly after I got into covering politics and got to know fairly well was Lee Atwater, who had a great, he was from Aiken, South Carolina, and although he had been involved in South Carolina politics, he knew a lot and had a great many contacts here in Georgia and knew the state very, very well. So he was, of course, very important in coverage of that 1988 presidential campaign, where he managed George Bush's campaign. And the column came about a year or so after that. Toward the end of that 1988 presidential campaign, Bill Kovich left the Journal-Constitution. And the new editor who came in, Ron Martin, had a little bit different philosophy about news coverage, and whereas Kovich had been very much opposed to columns of any kind, as just being not really hard news and not serious enough, Martin wanted more columns, and he particularly wanted a political column that would be what was called a three-dotter at that time. And a three-dotter is a column that doesn't stick to one subject all the way through, but goes, over several kind of high-point subjects. And a lot of times people like Furman Bisher, would write a column like that, and they would put 3 dots, an ellipsis just between one item and the next. So he wanted something like that. And I began to write a column that would have been 1989, I guess. And for the first time was able to come over here to the Capitol and cover stuff, because until then it had been kind of, specifically my beat was races outside of Georgia, like the Doug Wilder governor's race up in Virginia. I covered several of the big Texas races, Ann Richards' election, and then Ann Richards' defeat by George W. Bush 4 years later. I covered all the great Louisiana elections involving Edwin Edwards and the Edwin Edwards-David Duke race. Oh my goodness, just an awful lot of really good elective politics all over the South there for about 3 decades.
Did you always want to be a journalist?
No, I don't think that I really knew that I wanted to be a journalist. I had a writing knack, and when I was a kid, I was a good writer, and had great ambitions along those lines, but didn't really know how to put that, how to relate that to anything. And so I kind of had vague ideas about maybe I would want to write for a magazine, and I didn't even know how you did it at that point. And I'm not even sure how I was encouraged to get an internship at my hometown paper, the Montgomery Advertiser, but I did. And I probably had been there for like a week or two, and I just got it in my blood, and so those were kind of the old rip-roaring days, and when the people at the Advertiser got off work, they would go to this underground bar downtown, and all the people from the legislature would go there and drink until 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. You still had a lot of newsroom characters at that time, and it just became, I just sort of knew I was a newspaper man after I'd been there for a very short time, and I was a newspaper man for many years after that. I think I probably didn't remain a newspaper man for as long as I worked for a newspaper, because by the time I left the Journal-Constitution, that old concept and those old days had gone. They were so thoroughly gone that every newsroom looked more like a bank, than an old-time newsroom, and technology had so overtaken everything else that it was clear, and had been clear to me for a few years, that we were moving to something new, So when I left the Journal-Constitution in 2007 with a buyout, I went to work for Insider Advantage, which Matt Towery is the CEO of, which publishes Insider Advantage Georgia here, and also the Southern Political Report, which Matt bought from Hastings Wyman about a year or two before I went to work for him. So it was a great segue to give me something to keep involved in Southern politics, and I have done that. In 2010, I sort of took a leave from the Southern Political Report and came back over here to the Capitol and covered the last legislative session and the governor's race for Insider Advantage Georgia. That was because Dick Pettis, who I don't know if you've gotten the Dick Pettis interview in yet, but Dick has moved up to the mountains, and so he couldn't be here on a daily basis last year, so I filled in for him.
What was your impression of the state capitol when you first arrived?
This capitol, I would put it, you know, I think the very first impression that I had of the state capitol, and this was when I was a really young guy. As I say, most of my first years here in Atlanta, I didn't try to be involved in politics, but I think not long after I came here, they were short of the regular political reporters, whoever they were, and so I was sent over here to do a press conference that Lester Maddox had in his office. And I walked in his office, and he had that big sombrero, and he had every kind of knick-knack. He looked like every souvenir stand in the state of Georgia had contributed something to his office and hung up on the wall of his office. And that was really quite entertaining and colorful, and I always had a big impression of that. But I'll tell you, later on, my impressions about this capitol and this place were in a lot of ways kind of influenced by my experience going to other places. Mm-hmm. And it always seemed to me that the state of Georgia really had advantages and had benefits that wouldn't be immediately recognizable unless you had some experience somewhere else. And I'm really kind of speaking of the long term of Tom Murphy, because that's, you know, what I had the most experience with. But I think he set a tone, and you even today, you know, you've recently heard David Ralston talk in a speech about, you know, what the House of Representatives owes to Murphy. And I think there's a lot to that, because this place, traditionally through the years that I've been here, there's, you know, there's a lot of chicanery, as there is in every state capitol. There are a lot of things that get done in a kind of an irregular way, but there's more respect for convention and more respect for procedure in this capitol than in that of any of its neighbors. I'll always remember going to Alabama, where I grew up, and I know an awful lot of, you know, have grown up around a lot of people involved in Alabama politics and known a lot of them over the years. But I remember going over there one time back, I guess it was in the 90s, and I was covering something that had me at the state legislature, and I happened to be in the press office of the state Senate. And they were voting bills. They were down to their last week, and they were voting bills. And I wasn't even really paying attention to it at first, but then I noticed that the only people who got called were, what were their names now? I can't remember an Alabama legislator's name, but the one guy's name started with A, and the last guy's name started with Z. And they only called those two names. And I noticed this, and I after watching a few minutes, I finally turned to somebody and said, what is that? And he said, well, the way they vote bills here is if A and Z vote for it, it's a unanimous vote. Everybody voted for it. And it was just sort of understood that that's the way they railroaded bills through. When they got in a logjam in Alabama, they would just let A and Z vote for the whole. And I couldn't imagine anything like that here. There was a time when lobbyists were not as prominent in Georgia as they were in other states, and I can remember going to Tallahassee not long after they had erected these signs, because, and this is back in the early 90s now, or late 80s, early 90s, the first days of cell phones. They had such a problem with lobbyists getting on their cell phones, which set off the sprinkler systems in the offices, that they had to put up these big signs to tell lobbyists they couldn't go into an office to use their cell phones. And that's just how overrun with lobbyists the Florida legislature was at that time. And for a long time here in Georgia, I think there was more of a discipline about the legislature retaining control It's not to say lobbyists aren't tremendously important, but relative to other states, I think there was more of a kind of a feeling of rectitude about the way you did it, you know. Mm-hmm. And then too, I just think it's a beautiful building, you know, and there are a lot of things about it that I like the Mississippi Capitol very much too, and South Carolina has a great Capitol. But to me, there's a visual effect in this Capitol that I just think is stunning every time I see it, and that is when they open the doors to the two chambers on the last night of the session, and it only then becomes apparent that the Speaker and the Lieutenant Governor can look straight across at each other. Mm-hmm. And you know, and they get on the phone and raise the gavel and do the sine die. Mm-hmm. For me, political symbolism means something, you know, and I think that's a really, really powerful symbol.
Mm-hmm. Good. You mentioned Tom Murphy. He was not always easy on the media. How did you get along with him?
You know, I got along with him fine. I think I recall one time when I was just over here, I felt like I knew the place pretty well because I'd been around Atlanta and, you know, done a lot of stuff, but I hadn't been over here covering things. And I remember sort of being caught at the end of some session or something with Mr. Murphy and Mr. Lee and several others, and I kind of got the interrogation, you know, about where I was from and all this sort of thing. And I think Murphy he loved the state of Georgia, but if there was any other state that he had a great regard for, it was Alabama. He had a lot of friends over there and knew a lot of folks over there. And we had kind of something in common about that. You know, we could talk about politics in both those states pretty knowledgeably. So I always got along famously with Mr. Murphy. He could be a kind of a bear at times. But you know, if you're a reporter or any kind of journalist covering stuff, it's not whether somebody is crusty or whether they give you an abrupt answer or something like that. It's one thing is just honesty. You have to depend on people to not mislead you so that you don't put something in the paper that's not true, or mm-hmm. or you don't go off in a direction that is just the wrong one. And I think that in his dealings with me, generally he was honest. The other thing is you have to make news, you know, mm-hmm. and you can't be afraid to make news. And he never was. He was always happy to speak his mind. So he was good for a lot of copy. Newt Gingrich is probably another one who, you know, whatever you think about Newt as a reporter, you always had to appreciate him because you knew that you'd get a headline out of anything he said.
When you speak of sources, are there any ground rules to back up your facts quoted by a source or a party close to the situation?
Newspapers and TV stations and news organizations over time have tried to establish good ground rules, and it's a difficult thing to do. I applaud the effort to try to do that, but that's one of the good things about writing a column. You can be a little bit looser about your attribution and that sort of thing than you can be in a news story. The standard, the sort of accepted standard is that when you're writing an investigative story, a news story about something where you're going to hurt somebody, you know, with what somebody says, you've got to have somebody else to corroborate what your original source said. And most news organizations require the reporter to divulge their source to their editor before they go along. So, yeah, there are rules like that, but the problem is that everything is a slippery slope. One of the things that some object to a great deal is the use of the sort of the official source, you know, which is used in Washington a great deal, but used here in Atlanta and other state capitals too, where Maybe the governor just doesn't want it to be known, doesn't want to put his opinions between quote marks, but or some other official, and they use an unnamed source, you know, to sort of kind of put their point of view out there, put their position out there. There are some who would say that that's unethical to use an unnamed source like that. But you know, you can only go so far. Suppose you're in a situation in Washington in national politics, and the administration has a very sensitive issue, say it's South Korea, and there's some kind of a nuclear standoff. Well, it's perfectly understandable why they would, in certain situations like that, want to use background people, you know, use sourcing in that way. So I don't get too prissy about sources and that sort of thing. But in talking to sources and talking to anybody, whether they're on the record with you or not, I think the thing that you have to keep in mind is you know, what's in it for them and what you're talking about, and who might they want to hurt.
Mm-hmm. How difficult is it to keep your own personal political philosophy out of your stories?
I think it's something that you have to work at constantly. And I disagree with some folks who think that the approach to this is just to erase your own political philosophy. You know, there's some people who if they write about politics, don't register to vote even. And I believe that that is not really the most effective way to deal with it. I think that it's like being a scientist. You know, you have to develop a detached view of things. You have to be able to look at things in such a way that you can write about it without your own desires being, you know, reflected in that. You have to sort of get above it in terms of time and in terms of relationships, you know, to really be objective.
Mm-hmm. Have you ever felt the urge to throw softball questions to some politicians and curveballs to others?
When you are interviewing someone like I am being interviewed right now, which is just in a kind of a one-to-one basis, that's different than, you know, when you're in a debate situation or a public forum or something like that, or in a press conference type of situation. So there's really, I think there's a difference in the style. If you're interviewing somebody one-on-one like this, and all you did was throw hardballs, it would probably be a short interview. You know, you have to kind of establish a relationship. You have to, you know, if you want to get the best out of somebody in an interview situation like this, you gotta be a pitcher who can change his pitch, you know. Right. But there are situations like the press conferences and like the forums where sometimes you don't want to throw the hard ball, but you are called on to throw the hard ball, and I've been in that situation before, and that can be tense.
Does it ever bother you when some politicians accuse the media of being biased?
Well, you know, I think I told you that my first race was George Wallace Albert Brewer. And my family knew George Wallace pretty well when I was growing up in Alabama. And if you start there, you know, if you start from that perspective, he was probably as good a press baiter as there has been anywhere at any time. And so I think, you know, because of that, maybe kind of reflecting on that experience, to some degree I've developed a thick skin. It doesn't really bother me, you know, when they bash the press. But you do know, you know, if you're detached and objective about this, it's generally the case that when politicians complain about the press, it's because they've got a problem with something else, you know.
What sort of, well, let me call it guidance, do you get from your newspaper or your present management regarding your job?
It has varied from time to time. I don't think there is as much bias, coming down from the top at newspapers or in my present situation, as a lot of people think there is. But a lot of times it can be, the big problems can be things that aren't really political or that wouldn't necessarily pop up in a politician's mind. We had a situation at the Journal-Constitution before I left there that you could not, and I want to tell this story, you could not do a story without having what were called human voices. And that is to say, human voice wouldn't be you because you know something about what you're talking about. A human voice would have to be somebody off the street to comment on a political story. People who had no immediate connection, who were not experts. They were the voice of the people. Okay. Well, you can take that to an absurd place, and for me, the breaking point was when I wrote a story about the president. That was President Bush, the second President Bush, coming to Savannah for a fundraiser. And because of this rule that you had to have, for any story like this, you had to have some comment from just a citizen. I couldn't get to Savannah, get to that area before I wrote the story, so I actually talked to an editor and got clearance to write a story that says the president's coming to Georgia, and it didn't have just some extraneous quote from somebody. And I was on my way driving to Savannah, and I got a call that the story had been killed. And a story that said the President of the United States is coming to Georgia today was killed from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution because it did not have a quote from somebody who just fell off a turnip truck. And that's the kind of really dogmatic, rigid kind of journalistic thinking that calcified journalism and led to its collapse, I think, over the past 5 or 10 years.
Let's talk about competition between reporters. In the state capitol, it's very, very competitive. How did you go about getting your stories?
Make friends with the really competitive reporters. I think you'd be crazy to try and get in the way of James Salzer on any kind of revenue story. He's made that his beat. He's an intensely competitive guy, and if you gave him the opportunity, he'd try to be out on the front page with a new story every day. If you're a columnist, if you're somebody who's trying to put perspective on things, and you're not going to be the first paragraph under the biggest headline on the front page, but you're going to be in the paper, and some people are going to look to you to kind of give them some sense of what's going on. Then your best bet is to stay as close to those folks and know what they're doing, and follow what they're doing, and try to figure out a way you can complement that.
How do you deal with spin doctors?
I am going to be curious how all of that evolves. When I first got into covering presidential politics, as I said, I'd done the conventions in '84, but then in '88 I started going around to the different presidential forums. And I think '88 was perhaps the first year that the whole spin thing, that term had come into common usage, and they had started having what were called spin alleys, which were these designated areas that would be set up close to where the press was covering, they would have just covered a debate or a forum. And then all of the representatives of the different campaigns, the Dukakis campaign back in '88 and all of those, would come out and they would have a big sign, you know, that said who they were and who their candidate was, and then the reporters, so it made it easier for the reporters to find them and get spun. Spin has kind of, I think, kind of evolved a lot since then. And you know, really, if you think about it, I think that they've kind of been internalized on cable TV now. You see a lot of these guys like my old pal James Carville and younger folks like Eric Erickson from Macon, you know, who kind of become sort of 24/7 full-time spin doctors on the cable shows. But as I go out and cover politics and talk to people, the striking thing that you find, I think, in the last 5 or 10 years in politics, and this is a truth about the media too, people don't want to be talked to anymore. People want to talk to each other. And that is the fundamental thing, and right or wrong, that has changed everything, I think, in terms of politics. Facebook, you know, is now such is really where spin lives now. But whereas, you know, if you had been talking about spin doctors 10 or 15 years ago, it would have just been somebody who, you know, made a comment that got into a newspaper story that might have had some influence in a newspaper story, or maybe they got quoted on national TV. Well, now, with the evolution of social networks, I probably have as wide a spectrum of Facebook friends as anybody I know, because I cover both sides of the street, and I get Republicans and Democrats, liberals, conservatives, blacks, and whites. But my impression, very much my impression, is that 99% of the people who are on Facebook don't have anything like the diversity of friends that I have. And in effect, they're talking to each other. And if you can put a spin doctor down into that, you know, if you can have people who have access to like printed material, or a lot of this Tea Party stuff, you know, it gets disseminated this way. Well, that's a spin doctor on steroids. And it's never visible in the way that somebody being quoted in a newspaper or talking on TV was visible. But within the universe of those people who believe a certain way, they can be reached now much more effectively and with much greater impact than they ever were before.
Is that a dangerous thing?
I think I really think that it can be. The problem is not that people don't have the right to get together and use whatever means that they can to associate with each other and circulate their ideas. That's a great thing. But the problem is that there's no Uncle Wally on the TV anymore every night that everybody turns on and sees the same thing. There's no more common, agreed on source of truth, source of information. And, you know, I mean, truly there are people whose worldviews now diverge very sharply in terms of just what the fundamental things that they believe are true. You know, I mean, we make jokes about the truthers who don't believe that the Twin Towers were knocked down by Arab terrorists, that it was some plot. You know, or the birthers who don't believe that Barack Obama was really born in the United States. And if you don't hold those views, it's easy to be, you know, to sort of be dismissive of that. But the problem is that people are now able to separate themselves from each other in such a way that the ones who believe that Barack Obama wasn't born in Hawaii can spend all day conversing and exchanging messages with those who believe exactly the way they do, and they never have to entertain any information or anything that challenges their beliefs. And that goes both ways. And it is a dangerous thing.
Do you think that some sort of rules and regulations could deal with that question?
No. the media is free, you know, and there's nothing, I don't think, rules and that's, you know, we're in the middle right now of a situation in northern Africa and the Middle East that I hope it's not as dramatic as I think it is. I think it may be the biggest story that we'll know about in the next coming year. But the striking thing to me about that is that you have now people in little towns in Tunisia who are able to organize through Facebook and Twitter. And you know, that's just astonishing. So, and in Egypt now, I know they've cut off telephones and internet connections in an attempt to stop this. I don't think that attempt will be successful. And I don't think that there's any easy way to put rules and regulations on people just associating with each other, which is what these social networks are.
There seems to be more corruption in government now than ever. Is the media doing a good job of reacting to corruption?
Yes and no. I think that one of the things that may not be apparent about the problems of newspapers and news organizations over the past few years is that in terms of state government coverage, they now are much more limited in the way that they approach things. And the temptation is actually to cover scandals at the expense of everything else. And sometimes in a very deliberate way. I don't know if you know anything about the case of former Governor Easley up in North Carolina, but the way the Raleigh News and Observer went after him after he left office was a very programmatic thing, and quite frankly, it had not only to do with the value of the news story to them, it was he had been involved in some questionable activities, but it was a cost-effective thing. If they were going to do any investigative reporting at all, they wanted it to be for a big target, and they wanted guaranteed results. And they wouldn't go after stories that didn't give them that guarantee. And you see that in other cases too. If you look at this last governor's race, you know, there was a lot of coverage about Governor Deal's personal finances and a lot of that, so there was no holding back on that. But on the other hand, and I'm guilty of this, I'm actually back on the regional beat now with the Southern Political Report, but from what I've heard from reporters who have been over here for the first few days, they are struck by the dramatic decline in the number of people who are just sort of covering the day-to-day stuff. And as someone who, the first thing I do every day is get up early and go through the websites of about a dozen newspapers around the South just to see what's going on. And the decline in coverage of just routine legislative news is dramatic, just even over a year or so. You know, you just don't see the sort of, and you know, a lot of times this may be routine. It may not involve any big scandal, but just the fact that a lot of people now don't know about major legislation that's moving through their legislature until it happens practically.
So the gotcha attitude is...
The gotcha attitude is cost effective. It makes a big splash, and sometimes those who get got need to be got. But that doesn't replace doing a lot of the really necessary stuff that would inform people about what's going on.
Where do you draw the line between a politician's professional life and his personal life, his or her personal life?
Again, that is a difficult thing to draw the line on, and you know, I think you had to take almost every individual case and look at it. I think it was in bounds to talk about Governor Deal's finances and this store that he got involved in with his daughter and his son-in-law. Now that's family business and personal stuff, but pretty clearly, if the governor is going to be coming into office owing more than he's worth, then everybody needs to know about that. A lot of times you get into questions, you hear things, and you learn things about romantic dalliances of different politicians. And I think you have to, or my belief has always been, is that you have to have a pretty high standard before you go after something like that. For one thing, because if you start going after that, you could go after a lot of people. The whole Glenn Richardson fiasco, affair, whatever, I think was perfectly justified because the man's ex-wife made the accusation that he had been with a lobbyist who, for the company for whom he was carrying a bill. But if that had not been the case, if it had not involved some sort of state business, even though I don't think it's the right thing, I think it would have been questionable whether that would have been in bounds if there had not been some real question. I'll tell you a story that now that I've left the AJC, I guess I can probably reveal some state secrets, but this is probably the best case I know of the conflicts that people can have. When the Monica Lewinsky scandal broke, Newt Gingrich, our Washington Bureau, was aware, as anybody could have been aware, that every morning in the Agriculture Department cafeteria, Newt met this young blonde who later would become Mrs. Newt Gingrich III. And they would chat and have coffee with each other, and they were obviously an item. And that's all that our people in Washington knew. And Gingrich did not make it easy for them because, and you may remember this, while he had been very quick throughout his career to attack Democrats and attack them on intensely moral lines, if you'll recall, when the accusations about Monica Lewinsky came out, he was extremely circumspect in not being critical and not making any I mean, he said some sort of generally critical things, but he did not go after Clinton, and he did not make any kind of point of moralizing about the personal failings of Bill Clinton. And this one was not my call, actually. It was the Cox Washington bureau chief. But the decision was made that because Gingrich had not joined in to this sort of feeding frenzy around Clinton, that there was no good reason to go after him or to pursue this thing about what he's doing with this young lady every morning in the Ag Department cafeteria. And they didn't. And they knew about that for months and months through the entire impeachment trial and never did a thing about it. And I told Michael Isikoff, that there's another Washington U grad, about that one time, and he was just absolutely horrified. But I do believe in that standard that when it involves those kinds of stories, you have to show a very, very clear relationship between a person's public life and their public responsibility and what they're doing in their personal life.
During your career doing political journalism, you must have met some Georgia representatives and senators who made a mark on you. Let's talk about some of those.
There are a lot of them. We've talked about Murphy, and we could talk about Murphy for another half an hour, because to me, he in a lot of ways was, I think, maybe the most remarkable public official I've ever been around. He was quite a strong man. You remember some people, you know, with affection and a little bit of humor, and some people in different ways. We haven't talked very much about Zell Miller. And you asked me about Murphy, and Murphy and his sometimes strained relationship with the press. I actually, I've worked now with Matt for a few years, but the first time I ever saw Matt was, I guess it would have been, it had to, 89, I guess, maybe it would have been early for that race, but there was no, that's right, he ran in the 88 race. Well, the last time Zell ran for lieutenant governor, Matt opposed him. And I remember seeing Matt at a forum with Zell, and Matt was the Republican. There may have been a Libertarian there, and Zell came in a plaid shirt. You know, it was an environmental. It was an environmental forum, and Zell came in this kind of plaid, outdoorsy type of shirt. And I wrote a little column about it, and I said something about, you know, he dressed the part or something like that. And I got a call from Zell, and he was ticked off about some little thing that I'd said. And I don't think anybody who's ever been around Zell would put anybody ahead of him in terms, I mean, Murphy you might have gotten, you know, a little bit of a kick, but Zell would just call you up and just run you down. Harold Ford Jr. is the only other guy I've ever been around. Harold Ford, in the middle of his Senate race, that Senate race that he lost up in Tennessee, he got very upset about a story that I wrote that I was upset about too, and he called me up one Sunday and just, I got a word in after 40 minutes. But other than Harold, I think probably the phone call that you would dread the most if you were a reporter would be from Zell Miller, because he could really go after you.
Did you write much about his career in the Senate?
No. You mean as lieutenant governor or?
No, in the United States Senate.
Oh, as a senator. Some. Gosh, yeah. Some, but not really so much as I would have if it had been just a couple of years older, because earlier, because it was up in Washington a lot more, right after Newt became Speaker and during that period. It's funny, I remember when Coverdell died, I'd been in Europe with my wife, and she stayed over there to go to a meeting, and I came back and took a cab to my house, and I had 45 minutes of voice messages, and the last message in the 45 minutes was somebody calling me to say that Paul Coverdell had passed away. And I had to write a column with jet lag on about 2 hours' notice about Coverdell, and he was a guy who, you know, he was a very dry sort of fellow, and nobody would ever say he was the most beloved guy. In fact, he probably had more problems in the Republican Party than he did in the Democratic Party, because it was such a contentious group at that time. But I had a great deal of respect for the way Coverdell conducted himself, and particularly during the impeachment trial. I thought that a lot of United States senators just simply politicized themselves and just rushed outside the door of the Senate to give quotes throughout that whole thing, and I covered a good bit of it. And I thought that, and I don't think anybody had any doubt about the way Paul Coverdell was going to vote, that he was going to vote for impeachment at the end of that whole process. But he did it with dignity. He never pandered to the cameras. He kept his own counsel about it until the end, and I respected that a lot. I don't think, I mean, you know, if Roy Barnes had it to do over again, it would seem to me he probably would not hesitate to nominate Thurbert Baker to that position rather than Zell. I mean, he would have taken some political flack for it, but I don't think it would have turned out anything the way that the Zell thing did.
Were you at the Republican convention when Senator Miller made his keynote address?
No, I had been at the convention, and in fact, I provided Governor Miller with the opening line of his address to the Democratic convention in '92. You recall, he had
hear this voice.
He had paved the way, you know, for Bill Clinton. And he had that thing about, you hear this voice, and he said it had been compared to, that it was, somebody had said it was more like barbed wire than magnolia. Well, I was the guy who had I'd written a column after he got the keynote thing and said essentially what he said there in those opening words of that speech. And then the 2004 thing, that was the first political convention in 20 years that I was not assigned to go to. And so I watched Zell on TV that night and then watched his interview with Chris Matthews afterwards. I don't talk to Zell all that much, you know, anymore. I haven't seen him in some time, and I know he's always been a complicated guy. But exactly what happened there with that shift to the right, you know, is going to go down to me. It's sort of like Pierre Howard's decision not to run for governor after it seemed he was going to run for governor, and there was always a lot of speculation about what was behind that. There's no full and complete explanation for the transformation that Zell Miller went through, and that's something a mystery I'd like to know more about.
Did you cover his race for governor in 1990?
I did. That's where I got to know Carville and Begala pretty well. That was a race that, you know, that sort of set the stage for a lot of things following on from there. I've always thought that maybe one of the things that happened to Zell, I'm talking about that mystery of how he came to get where he got in the U.S. Senate. I think one of the things that led to that was he had primed himself so much for that first race for governor, you know, and he had brought in these high-powered guys, and they ran a race that was not, you know, exactly like the way anybody had ever run a statewide race. It was much more kind of modern in terms of the media approach and the immediate response and all of that. And he had run against somebody he very much respected in Johnny, you know, or when I say respected, I mean he considered him to be a legitimate challenger. And he won that race. And then he ran that race 4 years later against Guy Milner. And I remember talking to, you know, I mean, I know Burt Lance and talk to him all the time, and a lot of my conversations with Zell were actually two-way conversations where I'd tell Burt something and Burt would go tell Zell, and Zell send a message back to me, you know. Sometimes it would work like that. But I remember Zell got into his first, and there weren't as many forums at that time as there are now, but I remember he got into one of his first televised debates with Guy Milner, and he clearly didn't know what had hit him. You know, this guy didn't know, and I remember sending word back through Lance that, you know, if you had just been watching this on TV, you would have thought Zell Miller knows a little more than this other guy about state politics. You wouldn't have thought he knows 4 times as much. And I said, you can't let that stand. You've got to establish the fact that you know, you've got this experience and it's valuable, and this guy doesn't. But they really caught on late to him, and they were shocked, and I think in some ways kind of had the wits scared out of them by how close that race was, and how close he came to losing the race to somebody that I'm not trying to say that he didn't respect him as an individual. He was a very successful businessman, but he just didn't consider him to be a real, or that was the impression I had, that he didn't consider him to be a real competitor because he hadn't been involved in politics.
Tom, Atlanta and Georgia have been two of the greatest boom stories perhaps in the last century. What do you think contributed to that great run of success?
A lot of it was, we've always heard a lot about the forward leadership in Atlanta, and I think that, they deserve a lot of credit for that. But I think the fact of the state capital being here in the city has always, had a very positive impact and was really a big part of that. You remember that the mindset back in the 80s, when I first started paying attention to all of this, was that, the rural interests were so much opposed to Atlanta, and there was so much alienation from Atlanta and all this and that. But if you look at Murphy's record in terms of the World Congress Center and a lot of things that he did, there was an understanding on the part of the leadership that this is the economic engine of the state, and that it needed to be promoted for the rest of the state to do well. And I'm not so sure that attitude still prevails. I think that has frayed over the years. And just as Atlanta is not the great boom story that it once was, I think we had the story in the Journal-Constitution this morning about unemployment figures and about the fact that Atlanta's not replacing jobs with anything like the speed of Nashville and Charlotte and a lot of smaller cities that are now really intensely competitive with us. And it's very interesting to me, and I wonder why more is not made of the fact that the leadership now is concentrated in such a small area of North Georgia, and political leadership from the metro area is, there are some Republican legislative leaders from the metro area, but you don't get the sense, at least you didn't in this last year's session, that metro interest had anything like the kind of impact or influence that they might once have had.
We were talking about Zell Miller. The key to his election in 1990 is said to be the Georgia lottery.
Yeah.
What do you think of the lottery, and how do you think that they're going to deal with it now that the money is not there?
Oh, I think that you can second guess the lottery, and now that revenues are a little tighter, we're talking about cutting back the lottery, but you really just can't underestimate the impact of all these people being able to go to school, send their kids to school tuition free. We've had decades of that now, and if we started to just try to calculate the positive influence of that, it would be very hard to do it. I got involved in this a little bit before Zell did. There was a fellow, and this is so long ago I'm not going to recall his name, but there was a fellow down in Louisiana who was a businessman. He had made, I think, a lot of money in oil and gas. And he adopted a high school in Louisiana, and paid for their tuition. Everybody who made a certain grade, he would pay for their tuition, and started a lobbying campaign. And they were one of the first states to do a free tuition type package. It wasn't associated with a lottery at that point. It was just, so a lot of people at around that time, were thinking about rising state school tuitions and what could be done about it. Obviously, it was a political problem, and obviously, it was one of the things that middle class families worried most about. And then you had the attraction of gaming, which was important. But that wasn't as looking back on that election, a similar effort failed in Alabama a few years after that. And the big difference there was that in Alabama, the backers of the lottery proposition did not get the black clergy on their side, and black clergy vocally opposed it there. We tend to take hope for granted, but actually I think it'd be worth going back and analyzing that election, because I think the people who wanted that, Miller and all those folks, did a lot of things right to get that measure passed here.
Well, it's 2011. Georgia has a new governor, and we're broke. Where does he go from here?
This is definitely, the most challenging fiscal situation that we've ever looked at. I mean, in all the years that I've covered politics up here, there's never been anything this dire. It doesn't make it feel any better, but we're not the only ones. And even those states that seem to be relatively well off, like Texas, which is kind of the success story of the last few years, they balanced their budget last year with more stimulus money than any other state. They used more stimulus money than any other state to balance their budget. Now they're going to use up almost their entire rainy day fund this year to square their budget out, and they're still going to cut Medicaid so much that yesterday there were experts in Austin saying that the hundreds of nursing homes are likely to close across Texas in this coming year. So we're not the only state that faces this problem. We've got some encouragement, I think, from the revenue figures that are coming in. But it's going to take a darn good performance by this governor to get us through this without some major dislocation.
Isn't it realistic to assume that under these circumstances you either need more taxes or drastic cuts in state programs?
And so we appointed this tax reform commission, and I attended, a number of the meetings. I didn't attend the last meeting of the tax commission, but I think I went to every one other than that. I didn't go to the field hearings that they had. And just the appointment of that commission was itself an admission that the legislature had a task before it that it could not confront, that it really could not do what it knew it was going to have to do, which is either raise revenues in some form or fashion or cut back, and not just cut back in ways that pinch a little bit, but in ways that really do hurt. There's nothing but hurt in the cuts that the state is looking at this year. It's not to say that every program is run with maximum efficiency, but most of the really obvious savings have been absorbed over the last few years, and we're really down to tough choices now.
Well, I'm not a legislator, but I think if I were, I would find it very difficult to vote to put the taxes back on.
I can't see it. I really don't. I guess it may be a little cynical, but I think probably the most likely fate of that commission report is that it's going to hang there in the middle of the air for a while and kind of fade away like the Cheshire Cat. Because I just don't see You know, and I think Speaker Ralston has, you know, kind of, if he hasn't stated this directly, I think his body language kind of indicates that he knows that would just be an awfully tough sell in the House.
Mm-hmm. It's like...
but what are you going to do? That's the problem. The problem is, you know, that commission was set up to deal with the situation that Ralston and Cagle and all these folks were very sharply aware of last year after the whole, you know, bitter fight over the hospital bed tax. Mm-hmm. Anything, though, that the commission, you know, the fight over the bed tax compared to taking the exemption off food, off groceries, is not even anything much, you know? So I don't see how they...
How about the regional sales tax for transportation? It's going to lie out there for another year.
Yeah. And I think the longer it lies out there, again, the less it's sort of like the Cheshire Cat. There may have been a lot of great aspirations for all of that, but just almost as soon as the, you know, the legislation to enable that was enacted, you had people saying that really it was only going to be the metro Atlanta region, you know, that had any chance of passing something like this. I don't know if that will prove to be true or not. But it's just difficult, and you look at the, you know, the tug of war between the mayor of Atlanta and these suburban mayors over this, the committee that divvies up the projects. Politically, it doesn't look very viable right now.
Let's go to 2002. Georgia, for the first time in 138 years, had a Republican governor. How did that happen?
It happened in a way that was really dramatic and unexpected. You know, I think when the Republican change took place, then, you know, there was just an awful lot of movement and the re-election of Sonny Perdue, and then the easy election of Nathan Deal sort of shows how once the Republican surge started, it really was all-encompassing, or has been here for a while. There were several things about it. I think that you know, the Roy Barnes' various problems that he incurred as governor, the flag and the whole outer perimeter fight, and his squabbles with the teachers, you know, all of those things have been discussed in great detail, and they clearly had a lot to do with his being defeated. It was maybe didn't have as big an impact as some of these things, but I think that the redistricting fight, the reapportionment session, had a lot to do with that too, because it didn't affect voters generally as much, but I think opinion makers in a lot of areas of Georgia were offended by the way Barnes and the Democrats tried to draw the map that year. It was easy to look at the map and see a lot of political intent in the way that it was drawn. And so, among several reasons, I think, that contributed to that, that was important. But the other thing, I think, you know, it was a big trending year for Republicans nationally. Mm-hmm. He had the advantage of George Bush, you know, regularly coming through to campaign for, he'd stop off here every time he was on his way to Florida to campaign for Jeb Bush. And that was I think that had a tremendous amount to do with it too, the Bush factor. But the biggest thing, you know, was that Barnes managed to get himself isolated into a situation where, because of the flag, because of a lot of these things, he allowed the perception that he was kind of besieged here in the Capitol. You know, he didn't get out and campaign as much as he should have. And Sonny Perdue worked those Friday night football games and public events to the point where I remember somebody talking about him ordering up a big bucket of ice in his hotel just so he could shove his hand down into the bucket of ice after a day of campaigning. He had shook so many hands. Mm-hmm. And that was also a really crucial thing in that campaign, that you had one guy who wasn't given much of a chance, or any chance really, but felt liberated to get out there and campaign anywhere he could make a mark. Mm-hmm. And you had another guy who was sort of prescribed by a big money media campaign and the concerns of some of his advisors about him, you know, they didn't want him to tangle publicly with the flaggers or anything like that. And I think that inhibition subtly had a lot to do with Barnes's being defeated that year.
2010 was a big Republican sweep
mm-hmm.
in Georgia. Is there any way to explain that?
Well, and nationally, you know, if you go back and look, the other big Republican election, obviously, that I remember very vividly and covered in great detail was '94. And if you look at this one, outwardly, it's not as well organized as '94. You know, the Republicans took over, even though they have a kind of a maverick faction within their own ranks. You know, the Tea Party folks. And there, clearly, in terms of the national chairman and the congressional leadership, there wasn't anything like the leadership that they had in '94. But that masks some other really critical things, I think, that happened. And I know I'm talking nationally, but this really goes straight to what you're talking about in terms of Georgia. The Citizens United decision that allowed a tremendous amount of money to be poured in to not only for advertising but to finance all these grassroots groups, had a big impact on this election. The other thing that had a big impact was '94 took place 3 years after the lines had been drawn. This took place the year before the lines will be drawn. Mm-hmm. And if you look across the country, look at the Alabama legislature, which went Democrat to Republican. Look at the North Carolina legislature, which went Democrat to Republican. Look at Tennessee, where they had a bare majority that became a much stronger majority after this election. If you look at that, then what you see is a potential impact that could go on much longer and be much stronger for the Democrats after this election, because they're going to draw the maps that people will run in next year all across the country. And Georgia, clearly, you know, the ease with which all of the statewide Republican candidates won re-election was reflective of that big wave. Mm-hmm. Question is, how long can that last? I have always been of the opinion that we were never going to go back to the kind of one-party politics that we had when the Democrats were in charge of everything in the South, because it's become a much more diverse region. And immediately after, in the immediate aftermath of the Civil Rights era, there were a lot of white Democratic politicians who sort of grew up, and through 20 years of politics, grew up with the notion of biracial coalitions was how they win races. Mm-hmm. That almost completely failed in this last election, and that to me is the big question mark that looms over this. Mm-hmm. If you look across the South, blacks are disenfranchised, and this is ironic with an African American president, but blacks are disenfranchised to a degree, and by disenfranchised, you know, it's not like it was not done illegally. They just lost a tremendous amount of political power all across the South in this last election. And that has not really been, I don't think, in the context of everything else that's going on, I don't think that's been discussed. And that creates an imbalance, I don't think, that can stand for very long. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know if somehow or another blacks are going to migrate to the Republican Party and continue to have influence that way. I don't think there's much of a chance of that. I think that maybe over the long course of time, you could very well have, with emerging Hispanic and candidates and Asian candidates, you could see a diverse Democratic Party maybe evolve that'd be a lot different from anything any of us ever really conceived of before. But I said before this election that I thought I knew more about what was going to happen after the election day in November than most any election I had ever covered, to know less about what was going to happen 2 years down the road. And I still think that's true. I think we could see another big swing in 2 years, but I don't know how it's going to work out.
Tell us, if you will, about your current pursuits.
I have, as I said, worked since 2007 for Insider Advantage, which is a company that was started, as you know, by Matt Towery and Pierre Howard, and Chuck Clay has had a lot to do as president of the company over several years. So it's a bipartisan firm that is devoted to consulting and its media properties, which are the website and James Magazine, and to polling. And it's been a real education. I went to work for Matt and I talked in 2007, around the time I was getting ready to leave the AJC, and we were both very excited about the upcoming presidential election and doing an awful lot of coverage around the South, which I was able to do. Almost immediately after the election, or right on the heels of the election, we were hit with the recession. And I told people that going through the recession working in a small business was a real education. And it's been kind of a bumpy ride, and we've had our ups and downs since then, but we have come into 2011. There's a new look to to Insider Advantage Georgia, and Gary Reese is more involved in producing that now. And I'm involved in sort of moving the Southern Political Report site in a new direction. I can't talk a lot about that. There's a lot of things that we kind of have in the works that we're going to be doing, rolling out over the next few months. But one thing I can say is to going back to the statement that I made before. Anything like this that you do, any kind of media enterprise that you are involved in, and I've looked at some things that really are far afield from what we're talking about here, don't really even have much to do with politics. But the desire of people to connect with each other and talk to each other, and their feeling of a sort of sense that how do I put it? That it's their right. That they are that they have I guess that's it. That they just have an innate right to organize themselves in any way that they wish to communicate and talk with whoever they want to. Really defines everything, and I think we're going to start to see a lot of kind of quasi-media, quasi-business enterprises, if I can be as vague as that, that are going to just follow on that. The fact that the best way to get to people now is to get to them through their networks.
And not the newspapers.
Not the newspapers.
Well, let's talk for a minute about internet news. how reliable is internet news? How reliable is a reporter's blog? Is that different from a column in the newspaper? Well, let me put it this way: do the same rules apply?
Many of the same rules apply, but some things are just completely different, and some things are so different just in terms of the medium itself that it's a fundamentally different game. And let me just give one example: corrections. If you write something in a newspaper, then it's finite. And if I call you Joe Short instead of Bob Short, and it's in it appears in a story, then it's just wrong, And that's where corrections come from in the newspaper. The next day, you've got a little box that said Bob Short was incorrectly identified. Okay. Well, that assumes that the truth is static, or that the information it has appeared within a finite time and is in a finite space. And so it has to be corrected because it's wrong that way. Well, if I write an internet column and I say Joe Short, chances are if you see it, you'll call me in 5 minutes and say, hey, I'm Bob Short. There's no record to correct. It's not like it's not like you're less responsible because you don't acknowledge the mistake. The mistake is just, well, let me put it this way, like in the evolution of a newspaper story, you might write several drafts of the newspaper story and you might have a lot of wrong information. But you don't have to correct that information or do anything about it because it's only the information that goes into the paper, right, that matters. Well, the internet is just sort of a slow bleeding stream. The things are always being corrected. Things are always being modified. And so that's just one example of a way that I think you can't apply the same standards of newspapers to the internet. Mm-hmm. Now, you asked the question about the blog. Is a blog as good as a newspaper column? Well, it really depends on who wrote the blog. And when you're talking about the internet, really, in the present day, and this may change, but in the present day, you're talking about this enormous thing that is everything from the New York Times and all the state newspapers, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, as well as intellectual journals and magazines, all have websites. And then you've got this enormous body of people who are just kind of freelance, And in some cases, there's just absolutely no comparison, no comparison between a great columnist like Tom Baxter, yeah, and somebody who just chips in their 2 cents worth, and sets up a blog to do it. But then you have people like Dr. Juan Williams, is that his name? The guy who's the Middle East expert at Michigan, University of Michigan, who has a blog. Not Juan Williams, Juan Cole. And if you want to know, and people who follow this news, this subject matter will tell you, if you want to know the latest on what's going on in the riots in Egypt or what's going on in Tunisia right now, you go to Juan Cole's blog, because this is a guy who speaks several Middle Eastern languages. He's in touch with all the leaders. He's on the phone or by email with everybody. And he's more wired in than the guy who covers it for the New York Times. Mm-hmm. So the answer to your question is it's such a big thing that you can't really make a judgment about whether one is qualitatively better than the other. One has got its strong points and the other one does too. The one certain thing is that the internet is the future. The internet, is
amazing, isn't it?
Is where we're going.
Well, what's going to happen to newspapers?
I think we'll have newspapers. I'm encouraged by what I see at the Journal-Constitution. You know, I'm not happy about their leaving downtown and going out to North Fulton, but they're profitable again. That's actually a very good thing, and I think that's one of the maybe slightly encouraging business stories that I don't think has gotten enough attention in the last year, is that a lot of these newspapers that were on the ropes have, and a lot of the story there is national drug company advertising, which has come in real heavily in newspapers all over the place. But it looks like some of these big papers have gone through the narrowest part of their problems, and they're on the way back, and that is a good thing. But one thing about the internet and newspapers, the internet is a huge, big, revolutionary deal. But I continue to insist, and I really believe this is true, and this is from my experience of years as the national editor of the Journal-Constitution and thinking about these things over a long period of time. Newspapers were in trouble before the first keystroke was ever put on a personal computer. It cost an ever-increasing amount to produce a newspaper with print and ink, and the cost, especially as cities grow larger like Metro Atlanta, the cost of producing a newspaper in one location and getting it across a metro area to a driveway across that metro area now is so great that it makes it prohibitive. That might, if the internet had not existed, by now newspapers would be sitting around trying to dream something like that up, because if they had continued to try to circulate newspapers, print, over as wide an area as the Journal-Constitution did 20 years ago, they would be at a dead end anyway. 20 years ago, newspapers and newspaper journalistic associations were wringing their hands in concern that literacy was dying out in the United States. And you would go to meetings and stuff, and they would have the latest figures about how kids weren't learning how to read, and every newspaper, you know, ponied up money to have newspapers in the classroom type of things and all of that. And if you had said to any of those newspaper executives 20 years ago that texting would be the big trendy thing right now, they would have been baffled. They were fat and happy and stupid in the way that they went into this. As someone who worked, you know, and got newspapers in my blood from an early age, I have to say that newspapers, everything that happened to them was deserved. It was a massive failure of leadership, I think, and a failure to see what the real challenges were ahead.
The Atlanta Journal-Constitution puts its full edition on the internet, because I read it every morning at a very reasonable cost.
Yeah, free.
Well, no, the one I get, the online.
Oh, you get the online. You pay for the stacks and all that.
Yeah, you pay $5.
Yeah, right.
$5 a month or something. And that doesn't seem to be a.
I think that if something like a Kindle had come along just a few years earlier, it would have been a critical thing and could have been much to the advantage of newspapers. If some publisher somewhere had bought up a lot of 10,000 Slate readers a few years ago and promised to give people a free Slate reader if they bought a 4-year subscription to their paper and let them get it on the Slate, I think you could possibly have weaned people over to some sort of a device-driven, paid model. Now, I don't know how you're going to have a paid model now when I can take this little thing here, you know, and fool around with it for 10 minutes and read as much news as I wanted to read. If I could read German and French, I could read 3 times as much news as that. It's unlimited.
Well, Tom, it's been a great pleasure talking with you.
Well, thank you. I have really enjoyed it.
Is there anything we've forgotten?
Anything
you would like to say, or
I don't know. You'll have to come come around and maybe in 20 years we'll do that again. I really enjoyed it. That was great.
Thank you so much.